Hi, I'm Andrea Cox, and I have the pleasure of directing the MD-PhD program. I'd like to welcome all the medical students, the PhD students, and the MD-PhD students to this wonderful event. I think it's becoming increasingly clear, I think to the lay public as well as to scientists and physicians around the globe, that it is really critical that we have partnerships between academic scientists and physicians, between people working in biotech and big pharma to really solve complex problems. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing from 3 alumni of the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine who are going to talk to you about their careers in these diverse paths. And I think this will be very insightful. So we're going to start with questions posed by Dr. Ziegelstein, and then that will be followed by a question and answer session. So please feel free to enter questions in the chat. And after Dr. Ziegelstein speaks to our panelists, he'll ask questions that you've posted there. So with that, I'm going to ask Dr. Ziegelstein to begin the event.
Thank you, Andrea. So thanks to all of our students for joining tonight, and thanks especially to our panelists that you're going to hear from. I know as Vice Dean for Education in the School of Medicine that one of the most common and consistent things that I hear from students is they want to speak to alumni, and this is just a great opportunity for doing that. What I'm going to do is read a series of questions that were submitted, and then I'll encourage you again, as Dr. Cox did, to put questions in the Q&A that will be read at the end. And I'm going to ask if people can, as they're answering, maybe first just tell us a brief bit about them, and then launch into the answer to the question. So the first question is for all 3 panelists is, as a student or even in your career, were there things that happened that you did not expect? And maybe Harith, you could start off, and then we'll go around in no particular order.
Thanks, Roy. My name is Harith Rajagopalan. I'm a proud graduate of the MD-PhD program at Hopkins. I was there from 1998 to 2005. I did my PhD with Bert Vogelstein, which I'm just going to jump through the suspense and share that that's going to be consistent for all 3 of the panelists today. And had the really good fortune of working while there with other PIs in the group, including Victor Velculescu and Christoph Langauer in particular. And, you know, a really great team of scientists and investigators working together on cancer research and discovery, translational discovery, which informed my future path. And I'm not sure how much of that to go into right now. I'll just cut to the chase, and went through residency and cardiology fellowship, and then started a life sciences company called Fractal Laboratories. We're now in our 10th year, and we're working on developing disease-modifying therapies, addressing the root causes of type 2 diabetes and related metabolic diseases. So the question is about whether there's ever been a surprise. And I guess the question might otherwise be asked, like, has there ever been anything that happened as expected? Because I think it's perhaps it would be more surprising for me to say that things happened as they expected, as they did, than to say that things happened that I didn't expect, because I never would have anticipated that I'd be sitting here having done this particular path. If you had asked me when I started medical school, I probably, I would have envisioned myself as an academic physician scientist. The things that happen that are unexpected can be both positive or negative, though. Like, and as a general rule, you want to be open to the possibility of the unexpected positive things that could have a lot of upside for you and very little downside. And I think in general, if you think about opportunities that you come across in your life that have potential for unbounded upside with relatively limited downside, you really, really have to think hard about that. And that's a really unusual way to think for physician scientists or physicians who grow up expecting a very linear path through their careers. But it's actually the unbounded upside with relatively little downside, and the willingness to embrace that, that's actually created most of the interesting opportunities in my life. And perhaps the most interesting and important of those, which I'll just spend a second on, is being relatively early in trying to understand what it is about bariatric surgery that's making diabetes go away before people leave the hospital. And as a cardiologist who was an outsider to the field of bariatrics and to the field of endocrinology, being able to bring a fresh perspective to that question was totally unexpected and completely out of line for my clinical practice or my research. And before going too far into that, I'll just say that's a totally unexpected and yet incredible opportunity that has actually shaped my professional career and which we hope is going to change medicine. And you got to be open to those types of opportunities, and you just don't know when they're going to come.
Thanks so much, Harith. Who wants to go next? No fighting.
Sure. Would you like to go ahead?
Thanks, Chetan, for volunteering me. First of all, I want to say to all those listening, congratulations. You've probably heard this many times before. Congratulations on reaching the pinnacle of medicine and higher education. It's an extraordinary accomplishment, especially these days. I know how hard it is to get into the School of Medicine and to do what you're doing. So for me, maybe I'll just be brief. My North Star has always been to impact human health. And as Harith mentioned, I also trained with Bert Vogelstein, and that was a seminal experience. And it was really the experience in that lab that motivated me to pursue developing cancer drugs. And I felt after leaving the lab, unlike Chetan and Harith, I didn't do a residency. I didn't do training. But what I wanted to do before embarking on the journey of making new medicines was to get a front row seat to understand how drug development and discovery are done. And I started by doing that at McKinsey & Company in New York, where I worked with large biotech and pharma companies understanding the corporate challenges that many of those entities face. Since McKinsey, I've held roles leading a research division at Novartis, starting a biotech company, developing 2 cancer drugs from discovery to phase 2, as a venture capitalist at Atlas, and started a biotech company that was acquired by Celgene. And most recently, prior to starting Centessa Pharmaceuticals as CEO, I was Senior Vice President of R&D at Bristol Myers Squibb, leading research across all therapeutic areas in the company. And so the question that Roy posed is an interesting one. So what was unexpected when I graduated is that there was a tremendous inflection happening in R&D right at that time. I think it was the mid 2000s, 2004 or 5. And it was right at that point that I think there was an inception of impactful medicines being discovered, truly impactful and innovative medicines being discovered. And that's happened over the last 15 years. What we've seen at that point, it was totally unexpected, is what was once silos in science, silo in medicine, silo in business, ended up being a convergence of science, business, and medicine. And what the result of that was, and it started with Gleevec in 2000 and then EGFR and ALK inhibitors, you saw a tremendous amount of really innovative drugs being made, with the hepatitis C therapies, the immuno-oncology therapies, PD-1 and CTLA-4, and then cellular and gene therapies taking off most recently. And so we're finally seeing over the last 10, 15 years where basic research in medicine are converging to science that matters for patients. In parallel at the same time, which was unexpected, is that there's been a tremendous influx of capital into developing these new medicines through venture, through private equity, through other means, through just plain R&D in biotech and pharma. And that number has increased over $200 billion a year of spend, which was just a fraction when we graduated from medical school. So you're seeing this entire system change in how R&D is being done and how medicine is being done. And I think what was most surprising at the time, and I think is still today, and truly unexpected, is there are very few people in the world who combine science, medicine, and business at the intersection of those three and the expertise of those three. And I think that's something that I think the folks listening on this call, if there is a kind of a call to action. It's to, be at the intersection of those three, because that's where you can make a tremendous impact.
Thank you, Sharab. And just want to take a moment to thank Roy and Andrea and Trudy for organizing this event and really providing me with an opportunity to catch up with two of my oldest colleagues. We not only trained in the Volstein lab, we started medical school on exactly the same day. And I really attribute a lot of what I've done throughout my career to both Harith and Sharab, who have inspired me in multiple ways. And so before I jump into that, I'm probably the person who's taken perhaps the more traditional route and stayed within academia upon graduating from the MD PhD program, staying at Hopkins for neurosurgery residency, and since staying on faculty since completing training. And it's been a wonderful ride. But when Roy asked what's the most surprising thing or unusual event, it's the fact that I'm still in academia. And the reason I say that is I came to Hopkins as a medical student from North Carolina, not having much knowledge of what broad spectrum of things a physician is actually able to do, or someone trained in science is actually able to do. So I thought being a clinician is about going to private practice, because that's what I saw growing up. So I thought I'd come get excellent medical school education at Hopkins. I was very fortunate to have gotten in, and then do training in some specialty, and then go back to North Carolina in a small town, or Charlotte, where I grew up, and practice clinical medicine. And when I came, I was introduced to amazing faculty like Roy and Andrea and others, and amazing classmates who inspired me to open my horizons. And two of those that I really credit are Harith and Sharab, who have been really friends and colleagues for my adult life. We came at the age of 21 or 22 on campus, and they had already sort of wanted to be in the MD PhD program, had been accepted, and had this path towards really embracing cancer genetics and cancer research, and had a strong interest in joining the Volstein lab much before I even understood that I was interested in this path as a clinician scientist. But became very soon apparent that path really is inspiring and a way to make a contribution to both human health and biological understanding. And so I was fortunate to be able to get into the MD PhD program for the first year of medical school, and joined Harith and Sharab in the lab, and been fortunate to be able to track their progress and feel great pride that they've been able to accomplish so much in a short period of time, and really appreciate the opportunity to be here.
I'm just a little country neurosurgeon, that basically. I'm just like your friendly neighborhood neurosurgeon.
I'm going to go off script for a second, because there are other questions that the students, but I'm going to ask you a question that I just want a one-word answer, because I was sitting here thinking, the three of you graduated from Hopkins around the same time. And to me, it seems like a very short time ago, but I was sitting here trying to think what our students are thinking. And because, for them, they might be on this panel in the middle of the next decade in terms of how long it is from where they are right now. So my question for you, it's a one-word answer. We'll go in the same order. Do you think that the 15 years or thereabouts have gone slowly or quickly? Is it a long time or a short time? It's a leading question, but I only want one word.
Blink.
Oh, I'm next. A long time. Long.
Instantaneous.
It's fascinating. I was just sitting here wondering, and that's great. Well, maybe later on during the other answers, you can elaborate, but I'm going to switch to another question that was submitted. And I think this relates to the question that we just asked. How did you decide on your career path? And in particular, when you look back as a student, is this what you envisioned? We'll go on the same order.
Okay. So I alluded to this in my earlier answer, but I did not necessarily imagined that I would be out of academics. You know, Chetan is surprised that he's in academics. I'm surprised that I'm outside of academics. And like Chetan, I actually, you know, Chetan may or may not know this, but I owe the fact that I went to Bert's lab to Sharab's very compelling of the virtues of Bert Vogelstein. He came to Hopkins with a very strong view on that, and I had not yet been sold until I started in the MD PhD program. So I owe a lot to Sharab, and I guess both of us owe a lot to Sharab in that sense. But with respect to career path, I clearly knew that I wanted to work on problems that felt important translationally. And I also knew that though I had had a successful MD PhD, as defined by high profile first author publications, I did not enjoy the process of fighting for grants and arguing over rhetoric in manuscripts. That did not hold any attraction to me. And when my first paper was accepted at Nature, all I felt was like, I probably cried with relief rather than happiness that it was over. And I felt the same way after the second paper was accepted in Nature. It was just relief that I could graduate and move on. I loved science. I loved translation. I loved the idea of what can we do that can inform how we take care of people. But the academic enterprise, I felt like something was wrong with me because I had success by any external measure, but internally, I was just so unhappy about what it cost emotionally and psychically to get there. And so over the course of time, it became obvious to me that I wanted to do something, I wanted to focus on doing something translational, but I was not really able to clearly define what that was going to be. And so I came to Boston and I started my residency, and because of the work that we had done, I got the attention of some venture capital firms that called me and asked me to help them take a look at stuff that they were doing. I got to know folks at a couple different venture firms in the Boston area through that. And I really got entranced by much of what Saurabh is describing, which is you take a scientific idea, and that is the first pebble. You know, if you're building a dam, the scientific idea is the first pebble. When we sit in academics, we think that the idea is the end all and be all of the entire objective of building a medicine, a company, but the idea, or often the first publication, is that first pebble. And that first pebble, as I mentioned to you, was really a struggle for me. All of the other pieces of building that dam were pretty darn exciting. And you needed to understand that pebble. You needed to understand what was involved in that, but actually pulling through the science to the product strategy, to the clinical strategy, to the regulatory approach, to the intellectual property, to the market, to the reimbursement, to how to sell it. That whole journey is so fascinating and so interesting, and yet also so critically important if we're going to complete the value chain from the original idea all the way back to something that's going to inform patient care. And I've now totally forgotten what your question is, but what became clear to me was at some point I thought, if I have a compelling enough idea, then I've got to run with it. And that's sort of the thing that sort of shifted my career path.
You answered the question without even knowing it. Saurabh?
Yeah, so I just have to get a word in on these two guys. So by chance, I happened to be the first in the Vogelstein lab, but both Harith and Chetan were far better students at Hopkins and far more successful in the lab than I was. So I think that's partly the answer to my question is that I probably didn't have a path in academia like these guys did. So by default, I probably had to do something different. And so for me, it was, I really wanted to make a medicine. That was the goal from the very beginning. And it was strange, and I didn't realize this until in hindsight. I didn't mind reading the New England Journal of Medicine when it came out. Was it every Thursday? But I enjoyed reading Business Week a lot more. And so I think that was just, and I later figured out is that maybe there's something wrong with me, but it's just it was an early interest in combining business and science and medicine. I mean, that was there. I just couldn't let it go, and it was reading The $1 Billion Molecule back in undergrad, I think, and that's what got me going on what Harith mentioned is the seed of an idea ultimately becomes a medicine for lots of people one day. But traversing that path, I think that was, to me, seemed very exciting, obviously not knowing how difficult that is, because whatever research we end up doing to become a medicine, it's the 1 in 20, 1 in 100 chance of that happening, which makes it a very humbling experience, which I faced throughout my career. But, look, at the end of the day, I'll say that, for me at least, it's that dream one day of helping thousands of people and just being a contributor to a medicine along the way that does that. I think that or a device or a therapy, definitely, so inspired by what Harith has done in changing the way metabolic disease is being treated or will be treated in the future. I think that's, to me, you live once, you give it a shot, and in our industry and industry in general, it's rare that one succeeds, but it's at least for me, it's worth the shot of taking that chance.
Yeah, it's so my perspective is a little different from Harith and Sharab's, and just to clarify, both of them had multiple Science Nature papers during their tenure in the Vogelstein lab, and set the standard ridiculously high for mere mortals like myself. But it was a great environment to be a part of. But the attraction of academia and the passion that I fell in love with for academia was based on really a couple of things that I didn't think I could find anywhere else. Number one is an ability to take care of patients. And, the technologies and advances that Harith and Sharab are working on really can impact hundreds of thousands, millions of people almost in an instant if they come to full fruition. I, on the other hand, chose a profession, surgical subspecialty, where you really can help one person at one time at any given moment. And so it's almost in a way the opposite end of the spectrum, but along with that comes, in my experience, a very intense and rewarding experience that is associated with being a clinician and helping patients and their families through what oftentimes is a stressful period. Combining that with an opportunity to see the life cycle of academia, meaning helping to educate, train the next generation of leaders, which all of those in the audience really are. And that's leaders in whichever field you choose to be. And I think that's one of the take homes for me personally from this hour session, is that you don't have to emulate any of us, or you could try to emulate all of us, or find your own path, whatever it is. I think that the foundation you're getting at Hopkins allows you to be successful. And so for me, being able to participate in helping to train and educate and mentor others in this part of their career, it's not that you can't do that in other settings, but as a student, as a postdoctoral fellow, as a resident, as a clinical fellow, as junior faculty, et cetera, all those relationships for me were amazing to continue, because I'm internally indebted to so many people who have helped to mold me and help me establish my own career, that being able to contribute in that way is of tremendous importance to my sense of satisfaction and happiness with the profession. So slightly different perspectives than Harith and Sharab.
Thanks. I'll just say I love hearing these stories, and I would imagine that our participants are getting a lot out of it. I always tell students that if they can find something that they really love and are passionate about, and something that they also do well, and something that people find valuable, that's like the trifecta, right? And all of you found it, but each of you found it in a different way and found a different thing. And that's what's so wonderful about, I think, Hopkins and about medicine and science. Maybe you can continue with this theme, and can you, each of you, can you talk about an experience that you might have had, particularly at Hopkins, that you think helped to sort of drive your success? Some key experience that you can reflect back on that you might want to share with the group? Harith, you know the order.
Oh, okay. Sorry. I was hoping that you would switch the order up. Okay. I remember once we were sequencing cancers looking for mutations, and it was late one night, and we had one of the first instruments that could do relatively high throughput genome sequencing. Though now in hindsight, you realize like how archaic it was. At that time, you know, we were among the world leaders in that. And this is not necessarily a story about myself. This is just a story about the lab and the Hopkins experience. I love the gutsiness that Bert had, that he could essentially work with a manufacturer to develop a 96 channel and then 384 channel capillary electrophoresis DNA sequencing machine, and then go up against the Broad, right? And then win consistently in sequencing and then demonstrating mutations. It showed me that conviction and commitment and faith in oneself is a heck of a lot more valuable than magnitude and momentum alone. I have a joke here in Boston that some of you may or may not appreciate, but you know, the joke is that the Broad is a beast that must continually be fed, and that defines a lot of the scientific trends of the last 15 years published in academic medicine. And yet what I loved about Hopkins and Bert's lab in particular, it was the anti-Broad. It was just a small group of people working their asses off to advance science just with grit. And that was probably more informative and had a greater role in shaping my worldview and my perspective on innovation than anything else ever has since.
Yeah, so look, I mean, Harith said it really well about Bert. I mean, there's so many stories that I think you can kind of recall from the Vogelstein lab that were influential. So maybe I'll skip the Bert stories, other than saying that I never met anyone, even to this day, who's as fearless and as focused and as a visionary as Bert. And that gets that you become. I mean, that you takes part of that with you, and that becomes who you are. I mean, there's no, you know, you can't deny that. I mean, that he becomes a part of you in that respect, and influential in all the decisions you make. And one of the things he mentioned before leaving the lab, I asked him, like, how should I make a decision on going to leave medicine, essentially? And he said, imagine if you had $1 billion in the bank, what would you do? And it sounds, you know, it sounds simple, but it actually, if you use that in every decision you make, it actually does work sometimes. But you know, it was that conversation with him that and I think a 3-page email he sent me on how disappointed he was with me because I was leaving the lab and going to McKinsey. But it was that you know, kind of fatherly, you know, motivation that he gave me, and also disappointment probably for not going into academia. But you know, it was starting at McKinsey, I think, where I had this experience of, okay, now I've essentially taken the last 10 years of my life that I've spent learning science and medicine, and now starting from the bottom with a bunch of HBSers, a bunch of law school grads, and some physicians, and learning about the business world. And that was a humbling experience. So, you know, but the learnings, ultimately you take that risk, and you realize later on that the learnings were priceless. The network that you develop and the people you meet can be life-changing, and the way you think and become a leader can truly help make an impact on the world. So it was a tough call. Bert was very helpful in it, and no regrets ever since then. Yeah. So.
Yeah, I think just to follow on what Harith and Sharab have mentioned, I think that there are tremendous number of stories of things gained in the lab, and I'll share just one about that precedes the lab time for me that I think echoes what Harith and Sharab have also shared, and that's this sentiment of focus and determination and work ethic that everyone in the audience is very familiar with. And once I had decided that really the Vogelstein lab is where I'd like to do my PhD, I arranged to meet with Bert, and he asked very simple questions. What do you like to read? How hard do you work? What time do you like to get into work? Things that are not particularly scientific in nature, but really get to the crux of what types of things he's looking for. And at the end, he told me, we don't have any space in the lab right now. And I meant it to, at that time, that, okay, well, lab is full. He said, come back in a couple of months, do a rotation in a high throughput genetics lab and come back and talk to me. And he was notorious for coming into lab at really early hours. So I got there at 5:30. He'd be walking around the lab. I said, Dr. Vogelstein, he asked me to come back in a couple of months. I did a rotation in this lab. Do you think there might be a space now? And he kept telling me there's no space in the lab. Keep doing another rotation. So after the third rotation, I come back. He's like, okay, I'm not going to get rid of you, am I? I said, not anytime soon. So he eventually let me in the lab. What I came to understand is the jargon of there's no space in the lab really is a polite way of saying, perhaps this is not a great fit for you, and that we perhaps there's another lab that would be a better opportunity for you. And so, I think that I wasn't sophisticated enough to read between the lines, and I feel in a way I'm glad I was naive, because I listened to what he said, and it's not the fact that eventually I entered the lab and joined Sharab and Harith and doing my PhD thesis. It was more of a mindset of a sense of determination that there are certain obstacles that may be put in front of you and that you really need to work. And those obstacles might be disappointing or not a path that you would ideally otherwise follow, but have value in the long term. And so during these other rotations, met amazing mentors on campus who I still keep in touch with, learned other scientific skills, met friends and colleagues. And so in addition to sort of preparing me for my thesis work, had a lot of ancillary benefits that I can now reflect upon and say, gosh, I really am so grateful that I did that and had these other unique opportunities. And so, I think the take-home point for our audience really is the common theme shared between all three of us, that passionate about something, really set a focus on it, and don't let these obstacles interfere with trying to achieve that goal that you've set forth.
We've all given PhD thesis or research related examples, but I'm going to sort of bring a little bit more of a clinical focus, because it's funny, like all of us, or Sharab and I, left medicine at different points in time and then have entered industry. And then one of the reasonable questions that you might ask is like, well, what are you taking from this time and effort and commitment that you made to medicine and to science into the new world that you've come to? And clearly it's, subject matter expertise is one piece of them, right? Being able to understand what the science that you read and being able to understand how to design and interpret an experiment in a PhD, et cetera. But one of the other things that the thing that constantly sticks with me is the interns and the residents that I used to come across on the wards at Hopkins are just like none other that you meet anywhere else. And I've been in some of the best hospitals in Boston. I did my residency and fellowship at the Brigham and MGH. And I can tell you, like, the commitment to excelling in the craft and the autodidactic nature of the Hopkins medicine and Hopkins surgical interns that I came across, I've just never seen anywhere else in my career. And so there's clearly like the subject matter expertise, yes, right? And then it's like the tenacity and the focus and the commitment that you got to make in order to be successful in whatever you pursue. And for me, that comes not only from Bert, but it also comes from like the countless interns and residents that I encountered who'd be up teaching me at 2 o'clock in the morning for God knows what reason, when they probably could have found a bed somewhere instead, you know? And, you know, there is really no substitute for the willingness to make that kind of effort. And then the payoff that you get from it, although the payoff is removed from the investment. And so you always wonder, like, what the hell am I doing? Right? But the payoff is going to be there. The investment comes long before that payoff. And you don't necessarily have the ability to draw the direct line between them, but it's there.
That's great.
Yeah, and maybe I'll just echo Harith's comments. I mean, I didn't spend as much time on the words, but you know, post Hopkins, the name Johns Hopkins is synonymous with medicine. Once you leave the School of Medicine, leave the university, and you go out into that world out there, whether it be everywhere from Wall Street to, you know, biotech, pharma, VC, whatever, there's a special kind of, you know, there's a reverence paid, and rightfully so, based on everything Harith mentioned. I think that people who have come before us have set a precedent of excellence in medicine, not just research, in medicine. And you look at some of those leaders who have come out of the institution and have really provided that sheen that the School of Medicine so deserves. You know, and I like to tell, you know, folks, like, look, from School of Medicine, from the medical school, is that, look, you know, you've done the hardest part, which is to get in. It's very, very hard for you to screw it up now. It's almost impossible unless you try. So take risks. You'll be fine. And the world around you will support you. If nothing else, by just the reputation that this institution has.
Yeah, maybe the other, and to follow on that, like, if you're contemplating leaving academia to pursue something in industry, right? You know, there's a lot of different shapes that can take. And a major hang up that people have is, what about the risk, right? This quote unquote risk. You know, not doing something is a risk in and of itself. Right. So one of the things that's really important to think about is like not making a choice is actually a choice. Not taking a risk is also a risk. And there is no such thing as a guarantee in our careers anymore. I'm sure everyone can appreciate that. And academics is, what I would ask you to think about is, imagine the choices before you as multiple forks in the road of equal value, because we need brilliant people in each step of that value chain that I talked about earlier. And if you're making the decision about whether to leave academics, I think you got to ask yourself, like, am I working on something that I find really incredibly interesting? Okay. Number two is, am I surrounding myself with the best possible people in the world? And then number three is, do I think it's going to go somewhere interesting? And if you can answer if those three questions are yes, then you're really not taking much of a risk at all. Though you may not know where you're going, it's not really that risky, so long as you give it your all. But if you compromise in any one of those three things and you choose to leave, then that is a risk. So that would be my simple advice, is to ask yourself those three questions if you're coming to that fork in the road.
Thanks. You know, believe it or not, you all have answered a lot of the questions that I haven't asked yet. But and Harith, you just addressed a question that I think I was about to ask, and maybe Sharab and Chetan, you can answer it as well, even though you kind of already did, which is, you've already talked about advice that you've been given, especially from Bert, but just in general. But these students that are here as participants, they want to hear your advice. So if you could say something, I mean, Harith just said, 1, 2, 3, boom, boom, boom. Are there other pieces of advice that you would give the participants as you reflect back on your life as a student here and what was to follow? I think they want to hear from you. What is the secret to life?
That's a pretty bold question, Roy. Maybe I'll answer it. Probably maybe a vanilla answer here, but look, from what I've seen in my career in various industries, whether it's VC, biotech, pharma, whatever, the world needs more leaders. People have said this before, and I'll say it again. And I think this group of students, the students that come out of this institution, have the capability of being leaders. And we're looking, and the world's looking for capable leaders who are visionaries, who are fearless. Everything we've spoken about. And I think I think there's an element of, the smarter you are, the more accomplished you are, there's a trepidation. It says those folks have less confidence for whatever reason, right? Thinking that there's going to be insurmountable challenges and whether they're capable of getting over those or not. But we need more leaders in the world. And especially now at the intersection, as I mentioned before, of business, science, and medicine. What shocked me the most is that there are just very few of those people around. And then the second is, look, build your network. I can say that every career decision I've had to make was a result. I can point to one individual, maybe two, who were instrumental in making that happen. And that comes, with, make as many connections as you can, develop strong relationships, oftentimes those that are outside of your comfort zone or field of interest. And then cultivate those, but also don't piss anyone off too, because our world is very small. This world is very small. Everyone knows everyone. It's very important to be a very good person, a kind person, someone who, people want to be around. So I think that's not something you appreciate early on when you're driving very hard and you're very ambitious and you tend to do, make decisions in certain ways, but you realize later on that our world that we live in the life sciences and medicine, it's very small, and getting to know people with different backgrounds and cultivating that is important.
Yeah, great points by both Harith and Sharab. And I'll just add that ask important questions that you think are going to have meaningful impact. And I think trying to set the world on fire, it's a catchphrase, but that really is, I think, the goal for all the panelists that you've seen today. And I suspect much of the fire inside that drives the audience that we have. And that's why you're at a place like Johns Hopkins, is to do meaningful work. I think with work that has meaning, you're allowed to develop a passion and a drive that is natural, and does not have to be sort of artificially generated by external forces, by external pressures or motivating things like a promotion. Or while all those things are great, I think that if one is truly passionate about the direction that you're taking, about the questions you're trying to answer, about the impact that you're trying to make, whether it's in any of the ways that the panelists have done thus far in their careers or in other ways that are unique to your own personal interests, I think that to me has resonated the most. And really on a constant basis, evaluating how am I spending my time? Are there things that I should be dedicating myself to that can make more of an impact in a positive way to the efforts that I think are most important? I think that constant reevaluation, reassessment is incredibly important. Life is not static and these things change over time, and being able to embrace those changes, I think is an important characteristic and something to always keep in the back of the mind.
Thank you. There's a question in the Q&A that I wanted to ask or actually an MSTP student, wants to ask, especially to Saurabh and Harith. So you're off the hook, Chetan, for the moment. I was curious where along the path to industry you decided to set aside clinical practice, and also curious about your perspectives on having residency training versus not in your careers now.
Sure, I think you should go first. I've been going first. Your opportunity.
Sure.
There's
Okay.
mutiny ahead.
It's easy for me to answer this one because I didn't do a residency, so I didn't have to make that decision to leave clinical practice. Instead, my wife's a physician, so I rely on her to write my scripts for me. So that's one benefit. But no, I mean, I think to the second part of your question is, do I feel, had I done a residency, would it have benefited? Certainly, look, if you have enough time and passion and energy, yeah, absolutely. I'm sure Harith and Chetan can speak to that far better than I can, but I think the answer is yes. For me, it's interesting. There's not a day that goes by that I'm not using some amount of clinical knowledge that I learned in medical school. I mean, it's textbook stuff, but just having that confidence, again, from a fantastic education like a place like Johns Hopkins, you do learn quite a bit in your 4 years of medical school, and it sticks with you. And I think being able to have that education and read the New England Journal papers and read the Science, Cell, Nature papers, and with with relative ease back and forth, and being able to apply it to what you're doing. Look, I mean, at BMS, we had, I don't know how many MD, PhDs, all oncologists, rheumatologists, all these folks in many of my divisions, and without having the MD training, I couldn't speak to them. I mean, it would just be impossible. So I don't think it's been a detriment from that standpoint, not having done a residency. I think we certainly would have added much more. But I think just having had just having gone through the 4 years of medical school was sufficient to do to be in the world of biotech and pharma and VC, certainly. So you'll be surprised how many VCs are very, very intelligent, and they haven't gone to medical school, but they're able to be very conversant on specific disease areas.
Well, I feel like I can barely do one thing well at a time. And so the idea of doing what I do and being in medicine at the same time is like just something I don't think I could continue. So hats off to Chetan for being able to maintain an academic research practice and a active clinical practice at the same time. I just don't think I can. Like, I'm the type of person who likes to give it like everything I've got. I leave nothing on the field at the end of the day. And that's it's all I can do to just do this one thing. Other opportunities have emerged over the course of time, and clinical practice in some sense was one of several things that I could also be doing while running this company. And I've said no to every one of those things because I really feel like I've tried to emulate my mentors' abilities to focus on the thing that matters the most. And I've really tried to be true to that. Now, when you ask a question about when you make the decision to leave medicine, I think the question really you're asking is like at each inflection point, when what is the fork in the road? What is the alternative that you're choosing? So for me, leaving my MD PhD, the choices were, do I look for a quote unquote super postdoc somewhere? Do I look for a regular postdoc, or like a traditional postdoc in a regular laboratory? Do I do a residency? I mean, those are or do I leave for some nameless, to be defined opportunity in the quote unquote business world? It's hard to have answer this question in the abstract. It's a heck of a lot easier to answer the question when there are a discrete set of options available to you. And for the discrete set of options that were available to me, going on and doing a residency felt like clearly the most compelling of the choices that I had. Now, at the same time, MD, PhD, residency, and fellowship is an incredible commitment of time. It's an incredible commitment of time during the most productive, most energetic, least burdened window in your entire career. That your sort of the mid 20s to your mid 30s is the most valuable productive years that you have in your life. And it is a bit of a shame to hand those years to a residency and fellowship program, honestly. It is a real shame. On the other hand, there is really no alternative to learning what you need to learn through an MD PhD program and then choosing to continue in the medical path. I think that there are insights that I had that have enabled my opportunity that I would not have had I not done my residency and cardiovascular fellowship. And I think the thing that may distinguish doing a residency versus not doing a residency is perhaps, and maybe this is right and maybe it's wrong, but it's my perception. I think I have a greater understanding of the patient's experience and unmet need than I would have had if I just did my medical training and not everything that came thereafter. Like witnessing the life of individuals through the course of clinic and that experience was informative for me in a way that, doing MD PhD alone would not have been. And then there came a point in time when I was faced with this idea of starting a company, and the very discrete option was continue in academic medicine, join the faculty at the Brigham in cardiology, and then let somebody else run this company that we and some venture capitalists were starting. And that was actually the default, was like, okay, we'll hire in professional management and then they will run this company and I will stay on as an academic junior faculty member at the Brigham. And the decision was made for me in a way that's hard to understand, in that I couldn't imagine not doing it. And so therefore, you could say, oh, you make this logical choice and then you weigh your pros and your cons. But when I went to bed at night, when I woke up in the morning, all I could think about was doing this thing and not continuing in academics. And so it feels like you're making these logical choices when it's all in the abstract. But when you have these discrete things, it's actually way clearer.
Thanks so much. I have one probably last question, given the time. Is there any potential risk in taking your discoveries to the lab in private industry? Does it close any doors to return to academia later, as the opportunity cost in those valuable early year as a junior faculty, like obtaining an NIH, or other grants? Anyone can answer.
So Roy, is the question, just so I understand, is the question if one were to go through the MD PhD or PhD or MD track and then choose to go to industry first and then want to come back to academia? Is that a—
Yeah, I believe the question is, once you go into industry,
yeah,
and you're marketing your intellectual capital, so to speak, does it close the door for return to academia later? And there's a yes, or even post-residency for someone doing research years in residency. So does that close the door to coming back into academia?
I'll say the politically correct answer is that it doesn't close a door and there's always an option. But the reality is that it's really hard to go back.
Yeah, agreed. I don't know of any examples of that, any good examples where there have been a success doing that. I think obviously the other way around works.
Mark Tessier-Levine is like the example, it's like the proof by the exception, right? Yeah. Mark Tessier-Levine was a Howard Hughes investigator, developmental neurobiologist, ran something at UCSF and then went to Genentech and is now the dean or the president of Stanford University. Okay, you can count those guys on one hand.
Yeah.
Or those people on one hand.
But everyone here should be ambitious. So
yeah. But he's not running a laboratory anymore. Once he left for industry and then he came back, he wasn't doing primary research. There was a guy who went to Novartis and then went back to do primary research, right, Sharon? Eye researcher.
Bill Sellers. Yeah.
Yeah.
Bill Sellers. Yeah, he went to the Broad after industry. Yeah.
Okay, there we go.
Yeah, I mean, the point is it happens, but it's not very common. So I think I just want to say there's 2 minutes, but I'm going to wrap up now because I think the three of you were amazing. I mean, I learned an extraordinary amount from listening to you and also enjoyed it. And I would imagine that all of our participants did. In fact, I think I can hear them yelling and screaming and cheering right now. I'm going to turn things back over to Andrea for some closing remarks, but I really wanted to thank the three of you and also thank the participants for such great questions and for listening attentively. So thank you all three very much. Andrea?
And Roy, thanks very much for your great job moderating. I agree that these were really, this is really a fantastic opportunity, I think, for our students to hear, for people really sharing. I mean, I appreciate your candor, Harith, Shrab, and Shaitan. Thank you so much for sharing your inspiring stories, your candor, and really answering questions for the students. I do think they learned and gained a lot, and I also want to thank the students for attending and hope that we'll continue to have interactions like these with our alumni so that we can learn and share our experiences with one another. Thank you to everyone for joining, and I hope to see you at the next one.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.